a plain country bumpkin and a prince to join in marriage.
Thank you very
and
much.
4 white mice will never be 4 white.
Thank you very much. My name is Joe Gary, and I am delighted to welcome you to Broadway Buzz, and I am especially delighted to welcome you to Cinderella. Now, once upon a time, long ago and far away, we all remember those lines. Our grandmothers or someone special in our lives introduced us to fantasy and introduced us to magic and introduced us to a world of what if, where fantasy is everything, imagination is everything, and anything is possible and probable. And one of the most beloved stories of all, of course, is the Cinderella story. This production is fresh, innovative. It gives us a Cinderella for today. This is not some mindless little girl that does what everyone else tells her to do. This is a very savvy woman who even gives good advice to the prince. So you're in for a very special treat. A story that is as ancient as time and as old as storytelling, but a story right now that taps our hearts in a very special way. And the very same things that made people love it in ancient times, or when it became a piece of literature, or when it found its way to the stage or movies or television, is of course the incredible magic that's a part of the show. And of course, all of this goes back to the brilliant music and lyrics, the works of Rodgers and Hammerstein. Now, these names are monumental names in our musical theater. Keep in mind, in 1943, when they started their partnership, they would literally transform the musical theater. And from that moment on, from the moment that Oklahoma opened to the present day, every musical has been influenced by the genius of their vision. I mean, we see them now as the most successful writers in the musical theater, but I want to remind you of the importance of their innovation. They moved the musical theater in a totally different direction. They made it realistic. They made it lifelike. They made it motivated. They made the songs have meaning. They made the songs be right for the time and place. They made the story an organic part of the music and lyrics. It was an amazing transition, and it was a transition that would literally change the whole face of the musical theater. Keep in mind, Rodgers and Hammerstein, in their career from 1943 to 1960, would win 10 Oscars, they would win 34 Tony Awards, they would win 2 Emmy Awards, they would win 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and then a whole carload of awards from drama critics and organizations and the Dramatists League. Everyone honored their extraordinary work. Let me go back for a moment and talk about each of them separately. They both had lives before they came together as a team, and their lives before they were teamed together would give them the tools to be as brilliant as they were in their collaboration. We'll start then with Richard Rodgers. He was born in 1902. He died in 1979. All through the 1920s, the 1930s, and the early 1940s, Richard Rodgers, as one of the greatest composers we've ever had, worked with Lawrence Hart, who wrote the lyrics and librettos for countless musicals in that period. Now, I just want to remind you, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the musical theater was really like a variety show. It was more like vaudeville. If a star came into a show, they might bring their own song. So it was very loosely structured and more in the tradition of a revue or a spectacle like the Ziegfeld Follies. But Lawrence and Hart would bring, Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart would bring tremendous distinction to what they did in their musicals. They gave us wonderful musicals like Babes in Arms, Boys from Syracuse, my favorite, Pal Joey. If you missed that show, it's still a wonderful film that you can see with Frank Sinatra. It has some of the most delicious music that was ever written during that period. And they would be the kings of Broadway from this period, from the 20s, 30s, and early 40s. They also, during the Depression, went to Hollywood, where they dominated Hollywood movies. So the end result was that they made a major contribution, not only on the stage, but also in film musicals, and they gave us a body of brilliant songs. What would happen was Lawrence Hart, all through this period, was really a rather serious alcoholic. And alcohol took over his love of the theater, and finally, by the time they did their last show, By Jupiter, in 1943, Lawrence Hart proclaimed that he really didn't want to work in the theater anymore. And at the same time, Richard Rodgers had fallen in love with a script called Green Grow the Lilacs that he thought could be a seminal work that would move the Broadway musical in a new direction. Lawrence Hart didn't want to have any part of it, so their relationship sadly broke up. Now, let me for a moment go to Oscar Hammerstein. Oscar Hammerstein was born in 1895. He died in 1960. His output was extraordinary. He wrote 1,500 lyrics for songs. He wrote the lyrics and libretto for 31 musicals. He wrote 2 additional musicals where he wrote only the lyrics, and 2 additional musicals where he only wrote the libretto. So an extraordinary outpouring. Oscar Hammerstein also collaborated. He, of course, was the great lyricist of the day. And in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, he worked with all of the great composers writing for the Broadway theater. Primarily, he wrote lyrics for operettas. And we have works like The Desert Song, New Moon, Sweet Adeline, all wonderful shows with very melodic songs. But the major contribution that Oscar Hammerstein made was in his collaboration with Jerome Kern when in the 1920s they wrote a groundbreaking musical called Showboat. And of course, in Showboat, it's based on Edna Ferber's brilliant novel. Showboat, of course, is about the story of life of performers on a showboat, but it deals with racial issues, sexual issues. It's a very powerful, emotional story, unlike the kind of material that was being played on Broadway in the form of musical theater. And of course, what they did, and especially what Oscar Hammerstein did, was he wrote lyrics that were so organic for the character, so germane to the storyline, so compelling for time and place, that the whole ambiance of Showboat is created through his brilliant lyrics. And then, of course, there's that beautiful score by Jerome Kern. So this is a groundbreaking musical that would be the first to move the Broadway musical toward the modern format that it takes today. Okay, so here we are now in 1943. Oscar Hammerstein reads a work called Green Grow the Lilacs. He's in love with this story. He goes to Jerome Kern saying, "Would you like to work on this with me?" And Jerome Kern said, "I don't see any possible potential in Green Grow the Lilacs. It's sort of a corny cowboy story. I can't imagine it working on the stage." So he passed on it. So at that moment, here we have Richard Rodgers, this brilliant composer, and Oscar Hammerstein, this brilliant lyricist, both looking for a partner to work on a project that they think could transform the musical theater. And so it did. The work would become known as Oklahoma. So the time is 1943. We're still in the midst of the war. America is in need of a shot in the arm. We need to have an optimistic, upbeat view of life. We need to have a new view of America and the basic values we believe in. And of course, that musical provides all of it. It's a groundbreaking, seminal musical. They created a kind of formula where the leading female role would be played by a high soprano, that the leading male role would be played by a baritone, that the supporting roles would have an alto and a tenor. And so that formula they would use through the body of their whole golden period. They would go on from Oklahoma to write Carousel, South Pacific, The King and I, The Sound of Music. I mean, these are monumental works. We refer to this period from 1943 to 1960 as the golden age of the musical theater. And they both were the major cause for this. There have been no other composer-lyricists that stand up to the brilliance of their work. Now, in 1960, as they were working on The Sound of Music, Oscar Hammerstein was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and of course it would be his last show. Actually, Theodore Backel just died, and there are obituaries about him right now, and he, of course, played one of the central roles in The Sound of Music. And the last thing that Oscar Hammerstein did was to write the lyrics for Edelweiss. Because they were told that Theodore Backel was great at folk songs, and so they created that monumental song from the show. He was too ill to take it to the theater himself. He had to send a messenger. And there's a very touching story I want to tell you. You know, all of their career, the public press information about the two of them, Rodgers and Hammerstein, is that it was the perfect collaboration. They were deeply connected. They both had wives named Dorothy. They both had wives who were interior decorators. They both had families. And the sense was they were inseparable. The real truth was they really had no relationship with one another at all. I mean, it was like reading those old movie magazines where you saw Joan Crawford with her favorite recipes in the kitchen. She didn't even know what a kitchen was, let alone what a recipe was. So the end result was that, you know, they really didn't have this life that they kept projecting as being the perfect team. They worked brilliantly together, but they had next to no relationship. Richard Rodgers lived a very fancy Park Avenue life. Oscar Hammerstein would retreat from New York as often as possible to his little farm in upstate New York, where he had a menagerie of children, animals, wives, ex-wives. You know, and this is where Stephen Sondheim would spend his childhood, incidentally. So it was an amazing place. But they really weren't close. And the final touching message that I loved was something that Oscar Hammerstein said to the man he had delivering the Edelweiss lyrics to the theater. He said, "I hope Dick," meaning Richard Rodgers, "will appreciate these lyrics. I've never really known if he ever liked me." And so keep in mind, these two men that had this extraordinary career together never really had a relationship. There is a new biography that's going to be coming out in a year and a half. It was just approved by the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization, where finally they will really go into their lives and we will really understand who these artists were, not the manufactured press about the two men. Okay, so they left a body of absolutely brilliant work. Just for a moment, I want you to be aware of the fact that Richard Rodgers then, you know, was only in his 50s when he lost his greatest partner in 1960. He would go on to live for 19 more years. And in those years, he would work with a variety of different composers, or different lyricists, including Martin Charnin and also Stephen Sondheim. And he would create works, a musical based on Henry VIII called Rex. It was ripped apart by the critics. There are many beautiful songs in Rex, especially Christmas at Hampton Court, but it is not a work that has had significant exposure, and a work that deserves to be done, you know, by Stratford, Ontario, or someone that could bring distinction to the classical side of that story. He also wrote a work for Lee Volman called I Remember Mama, which was a very difficult work. She was very difficult to work with. They said what she really needed was not a composer. What she needed was Ingmar Bergman, but in any case, it did play itself out and have a distinguished run. He did another work called 2 by 2, which was based on the Noah story, and in that case, that work was starred Danny Kaye, and Danny Kaye was so difficult to work with that he wouldn't sing the same lyrics twice. He would change the melody of the song. He did whatever he wanted to do. It became the Danny Kaye show, but it was playing to 102% capacity, so nobody ever fired him for misbehaving as badly as he did. But Richard Rodgers was very devastated by the show and never literally went back to see it. And then he did a work called No Strings, which had its premiere, incidentally, in Cleveland, and it starred Diane Carroll. And it was an interracial love story in the 1960s. This was very controversial, and Richard Kiley starred in it. It was a very ambitious, very unusual musical with an absolutely brilliant score. I would really long for someone to look at that piece again. I don't know if the storyline is dated. Certainly the music is not. It's magnificent. Okay, and so the end result is, he had a career after his great career, but it never equaled, of course, that partnership with Rodgers and Hammerstein. Okay, this leads us now to Cinderella. Now, keep in mind, Cinderella was created in 1957. It was meant to be a television show that would play once. This is in a period where we had kinescope and we had no way of recording it and redistributing it. So it was going to star Julie Andrews. She was at the height of her success in My Fair Lady. Keep in mind, she was playing that show 8 times a week. And then she would go and rehearse Cinderella. And the songs, of course, were all written especially for her. She said a very beautiful thing about the score of Cinderella. She said, "The waltzes in Cinderella equal the music of Strauss." And that is absolutely true. It's extraordinary work that's brilliantly done, and it was a vehicle for her. Keep in mind, when that show played on television on March 31st, 1957, 107 million Americans watched it. That meant 60% of America was glued to their television set that night. Writers said that they would look out on Fifth Avenue and the streets were empty during the hours of the live broadcast. It was one of the most memorable broadcasts that ever happened on television. And of course, it stands in television history as the most watched show up to that point. Other sporting events now have eclipsed that, but as an arts event, it still stands as the greatest event that ever happened. Now, ironically, because it was recorded on kinescope, it was recorded in black and white. It was played on colored television, one of the earliest examples of color television. But the end result was that it was on kinescope. Finally, they have transferred it to DVD. What I do have to tell you is the version you're seeing is superior to that version of the show. But what it did was it made Rodgers and Hammerstein realize that they could not only dominate Broadway, not only could they dominate the movies, but now they could dominate television. And so, it was an extraordinary work. Several years later, it was redone, and this time it was done on video with Leslie Ann Warren. And it played 8 times in 5 years. And again, it was a kind of show where the entire family would sit down together and watch that show. It was an extraordinary event. And people who grew up during that period, it started in 1965 to 1972. Families during that period all remember sitting with grandma, grandpa, the entire family, watching that brilliant and beguiling version of Cinderella. There was another wonderful television version of it that was done in the late 1990s. It was an interracial version that was done with Whitney Houston. And it was really quite extraordinary. Brandy played Cinderella. It was a great delight, had an enormous following. Over 60 million people watched that. All of these versions are available to you on film. Now, I do want to go for a moment and talk about the Cinderella legend. As you know, fairy tales have been passed on, literally, for thousands of years. And it starts as an oral tradition. The oldest example I could find of the Cinderella legend goes back to the 7th century BC, and it's a story that was told in Egypt. And the story is about a Greek slave girl who's bathing. A bird flies down, takes away her golden slipper. Don't ask me why a slave has golden slippers, but it takes it away and flies to the Pharaoh and drops it on the Pharaoh's lap. The Pharaoh is so beguiled by this slipper falling out of the sky that he wants to know who owns it, the shape of it, the style of it, the mystique of it. So there's a search, they find the slave girl, and she becomes the queen of Egypt. So that's the beginning of the story. There are examples of it in Africa, there are examples of it in China, there are examples of it in the Arabian Night Tales. It's one of the most famous tales about the idea of an oppressed heroine who ultimately lives, literally, happily ever after. And so every culture has this Cinderella myth. Very interesting, in the early 17th century in Italy, a brilliant writer named Basile decided to take all of the oral fairy tales that had gone on for generations in every country and decided to write them down and turn them into literature. And his idea was also to have illustrations. And so he was the first to write the story of Cinderella. In that same century, a great Frenchman named Charles Perrault was beguiled by that fantasy, and so he wrote a series of fairy tales, but writing them in very elegant French so that they became very memorable. When Perrault treated the Cinderella story, he added several important elements. The slipper element had always been there, but he added a lot of transformations that will be so beguiling to you as you see it in the show today. Number one, the pumpkin that turns into the carriage, the transformation of the mice turning into horse, the transformation of the animals turning into the footman. These are all out of Charles Perrault's story. I do want to tell you a wonderful anecdote about this. When Charles Perrault originally wrote the story, the word that he used in front of slipper in French, there are two words. One is V-A-I-R and the other is V-E-R-R-E. Both are pronounced ver. The ver he was referring to, the V-A-I-R, was really interpreted as, so we have the word slipper at the end, so this is the adjective before it, and the adjective is squirrel fur. So the real story is about Cinderella and the squirrel fur slipper. Now this sounds, more like Mammy-Yokum than it sounds like Cinderella. And because the word is pronounced the same in French, the French decided that they really liked the image of the glass slipper better than the fur, especially squirrel fur slipper. But I do want to remind you, Charles Perrault was very specific when he said squirrel fur was the most expensive fur in France at the time, even more expensive than ermine. But somehow, keep in mind, the most important single symbol in all of fairy tales is, of course, the glass slipper. And can you imagine if they had literally kept that translation as the squirrel fur slipper? So think of that. Okay, so in any case, that story then would be copied in countless ways in films, in plays, in musicals. Disney would use that as the source. The Charles Perrault story is the source of the musical you see tonight. Now, I do want to remind you that in this musical, the book writer, Douglas Carter Beane, has done really a wonderful job in making Cinderella more acceptable to modern audiences. She is not simply the abused heroine. This is a very smart, sassy young woman who's in control, who even instructs the prince in this version you see. So it's really wonderful, and it makes it very accessible for our time. I do want to remind you, of course, the Cinderella story has been with us in all. Keep in mind, one of the first films that was ever made, a silent film in 1897, was the story of Cinderella. Mary Pickford did it as a silent film in 1914. Leslie Caron did a version of it in the 60s. Drew Barrymore did a revisionist version of it called Ever After that was done recently about challenging the Cinderella story. And of course, even Jerry Lewis got into the act by playing Cinderfella. And then, of course, it found its way into ballet, into opera, into pantomime. Strauss and Prokofiev would do brilliant scores about Cinderella. So it stands as a major story that has delighted us, right down to the very present with Kenneth Branagh's brilliant version of Cinderella. It's lyric, it's romantic, it's compelling, it's contemporary. It's a brilliant work. So Cinderella really stands up. I have to tell you a story about Cinderella that's a personal story. One of the first shows I ever directed was a children's theater version of Cinderella. Let me set it up for you. The place is Cleveland. The time is the Huff Riots. The place is the Cleveland Playhouse. Carl Stokes was so desperate to make sure the children were safe in the inner city that he and the Playhouse came together and decided to have a children's theater that summer, and 1,000 children were bused every day into the Cleveland Playhouse, where all of the actors and young directors, myself included, and all of my students from Cleveland State, we all were there to sort of keep the children off the street and have a wonderful theater experience. So my assignment was to do We had no budget, of course, and we had children, who were little children who really had no theater experience. It was all done as sort of creative play. And my assignment was Cinderella. Well, I took this very seriously, and I wanted it to be a spectacular production. I had this little boy who played the prince who had a very serious speech impediment. So I found someone at Cleveland State who was studying voice and diction, and they helped train him. His great line, of course, is, "The shoe fits." So we worked on this all summer. The shoe fits. Okay, and the Cinderella I cast was this little girl whose claim to fame was she could take off her shoes, stand on her tiptoes, and dance without ballet slippers. I mean, she literally danced on her toes. But there was no place wearing glass slippers for Cinderella to dance on her toes. She was furious with me through the whole summer. I worked on this transformation that I really thought as being very important at the end of the show. Watch the show tonight. You're dazzled by all of the transformations, going from waif to princess, going from a little piece of fruit into a beautiful carriage, etc. All of these ideas are manifested so brilliantly in the magic of the show. So my idea was, in the final moment of the show, when the prince puts the shoe on and my little prince says, "The shoe fits," and then the fairy godmother comes out, waves a lot of fabric, and they take off the rags, and there she is in these beautiful clothes. I then had light coming down, and I bought all of the glitter I could find so it would come down through the light. So there is the prince and Cinderella in silhouette. I was so excited about it. So we rehearsed the show. We got out on the stage. We got to the point where the prince said, "The shoe fits." And he said it perfectly. I was so proud of him. But at that moment, the fairy godmother didn't come out on the stage with all of the things to wave in front of Cinderella so they could change her costume. She had stage fright. So there's Cinderella standing there, nothing happens. So the poor little boy says, "The shoe fits." Still nothing happens. He knows that what's supposed to happen is she's supposed to be in a beautiful gown. So the third time he says, "The shoe fits." All perfect, keep in mind. And with that, Cinderella didn't know what to do. She tore off her clothes. She was in her underwear. She kicked off her shoes, and she danced on her toes. And all of the mothers came running down to the stage and pounded on the stage. They were so happy. That was their Cinderella. Well, lo and behold, Carl Stokes comes up to thank me. I mean, he's furious with me. He says to me as he's shaking my hand, "That isn't the story my grandmother told to me." And as he's saying that to me, all the glitter comes down all at once on Mayor Stokes' head. So that's my story. Thank you very much, and enjoy the show. Thank you.